everybody to what is our second of our series of EduSpots author talks. So for those of you who haven't come to our author talks before, the primary aim of these is really to bring together a community of people who are interested in discussing social issues and great ideas, all based through the medium of books and literature. And if you haven't come across EduSpots before, EduSpots is a community of community educators, and together we look to train, equip and connect local volunteers who are keen to drive community-led change through education centres that we call spots, of which there are currently 50 across Ghana and Kenya, and might one day be a sort of global phenomenon, who knows? And all these spots are owned and managed by community members. A key part of EduSpots' work is literacy development and also promoting creativity among students of all ages, and also just encouraging engagement in social issues and equipping people collectively with the skills to grow and act as active citizens in different ways. So given all this, I think you can quickly see that we are very lucky to have Christy Lefteri with us. So just, I'm not going to, I'm just spotlighting you, Christy, just to give a bit of background on Christy, her book, The Beekeeper of Aleppo, is perhaps her most famous book so far, in that it has sold over 1 million copies and has been nominated and applauded with a number of awards. But today we're particularly going to be discussing Songbirds, which is a book I really enjoyed reading. So welcome, Christy, to this EduSpots author talk.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to speak. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. And I was wondering if you could just start by telling us a little bit about what motivated you to write Songbirds in particular.
Right. So, there's two things in particular. So shall I say a little bit first, like a little summary of the story? So it's kind of, the story is about Nisha, who's a domestic worker from Sri Lanka. She moves to Cyprus in order to give her daughter a better chance at life after her husband dies. So she migrates from Sri Lanka to Cyprus and brings up her employer's daughter instead of her own daughter. So while her daughter is being brought up by her mother-in-law in Sri Lanka, she's bringing up somebody else's daughter. And the story begins on the day that she vanishes. And the book is told from the perspective of her employer, Petra, who Nisha has worked for 10 years, and also from her lover, Yanis, who's truly in love with her. And through their search for her, they start to discover a lot, not only about her life, but about the life of other domestic workers in Cyprus and friends of Nisha's. So I won't say too much about the story, but it's kind of loosely based on true events where 5 domestic workers and 2 children went missing in Cyprus and nobody searched for them. This was a few years ago, 4 years ago this happened, and nobody searched for them because they were foreign. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this people, I don't want to say too much about what transpired because people will discover that in the story, but it was very sad and also horrific. And sadly, it took an event like this for people to open their eyes and for the government to realize that foreign domestic workers needed to be treated like human beings, basically. So the reason I started writing this novel, so when I finished writing Beekeeper, I said to a friend of mine that I wanted to write about something I was just as passionate about, because obviously with Beekeeper, I was working with refugees in Athens, and I didn't want to just choose any story to write. I wanted to write something that really touched my heart. So anyway, one morning I was talking with my friend Anna, and I said, I'm really adamant that I'm really passionate about the thing I write about. So she knows the kind of stuff I'm interested in. And one morning I woke up and she'd sent me an article about these 5 women and 2 children that had gone missing, and the police refused to search for them, even when family members and friends were saying, I know they wouldn't have just run away. Something wrong has happened. Nobody searched for them. You imagine that, 2 children as well. It's sort of, it's so shocking. I mean, imagine that happening here. So anyway, I looked into it more. And when I discovered what had happened, I decided that I wanted to go to Cyprus and meet domestic workers and find out about their experiences, like whether they feel that they have a voice, why they migrated in the first place, what the journeys meant to them, what was going on back home, what did the journey and the migration to another country, what were the reasons behind it? You know, I wanted to really hear their stories and to understand why they decided to leave, but also what it felt like once they got there. And what I discovered was that often, I mean, there seemed to be like 2 reasons why women were traveling. One was because they wanted to send money back home in order to give their to give their children a better education, or simply that they couldn't make ends meet with the jobs that were available to them at home, and they felt that their family or themselves were suffering because of it. So that was one reason, to support family members. And sometimes it was their mother and father, sometimes it was siblings, so often it was their own children that they were leaving. The other reason was it was often younger women who had left because they were trying to escape an arranged marriage or a situation where they felt quite trapped, and they just wanted to be independent women like we all do. And so they heard, oh, a friend of mine's moved to this country and has become a domestic worker. I could do that, for example. So they tried that, thinking, searching for freedom, for independence. And sadly, no matter what the reason was behind their migration, they often found themselves more trapped because of the way that the system was, with loads of debt. And if something was going on, like if they were being abused by their employers, they couldn't leave because they were indebted to the agencies that sent them over, and they weren't heard. So they couldn't go to the police. Nobody was listening to them. So they'd be stuck in these really abusive situations and living in these houses where they were being abused, or they were underpaid, less than the minimum wage. They were working hours that were outside of their contracts and they were forced to do so. And there was nowhere for them to turn. So I went to Cyprus and researched all this, and then spoke to loads of women and met a man who was the head of an organization there that helped domestic workers. And he told me loads and loads of stuff about how people, when the women went missing, when their friends were going to the police and the police weren't listening, they'd go to him. And he knew, he said, from the first woman that came to him begging for his help, he knew something was terribly wrong, and nobody was listening. So when I discovered all this stuff, now luckily I went to Cyprus just before the lockdown, so I managed to do all this research, and then I came back and started writing the novel, and then we went into lockdown. So the rest of the research, like I did more research. There were domestic workers that I met here in London. I went to a place in Holborn and heard some stories there. But then there was other research I needed to do about the poaching of the songbirds. So the rest of the research I had to do on Zoom. So it wasn't the same but it was better than nothing. And I was grateful that I did get to face meet women, speak to them, understand them, hear so many stories. And so that was the first thing that inspired. Well, that was one thing. And the other thing is that I go to Cyprus, well, before lockdown, nearly every year, because so much of my family lived there. And I used to go and stay with a family member who hired a domestic worker. And me and her were of a similar age. And she'd left 2 of her daughters in Sri Lanka after her husband died, left them with her mother-in-law. And when I first met her, she hadn't seen her daughters face to face for 8 years. And I got to know her. I was going through a divorce at the time. we spoke a lot. You know, she was saying to me stuff like, oh, do you want a new relationship? You'll meet someone, you know, like how, you know, like a normal friendship. We just developed such a nice friendship. And then she was crying to me because she was saying that she would go downstairs and nobody would say good morning to her. And she just felt unappreciated. And she wasn't, even in the times where, even when she had her times off, she wasn't allowed to go out. She just couldn't, she wasn't allowed to go out. And her employers only let her go out on Sundays for like 2 hours if it was to go to church. And she just felt like a child. She felt trapped. She felt that she couldn't be an autonomous grown-up woman. She, you know, and she cried to me once and said, by the time you come back to Cyprus again, I would have left. And she did. She was lucky. She managed to find other employment. And I've spoken to her a few times since. But I remember being there without her and really missing her. And then so when I heard these stories about the women that had gone missing, I thought that could have been her. And I knew how much she sacrificed for her daughters. And I thought, imagine if she'd gone missing, imagine if nobody had searched for her. So that was the emotion that kind of fed my desire to research and my desire to write the story. And I know that was a super long answer, but because there was so much behind it, behind my decision.
So I can see that freedom and understanding different forms of freedom and the choices that people make is a really big part of this book. And I think I read somewhere that you found that with the Beekeeper of Aleppo, a lot of people obviously, you know, really thought the book was brilliant, but might have not understood that migrants also face very difficult journeys or make difficult choices that are perhaps not as explored to the same degree. And just wonder if you could talk to us a bit more about the concept of being free and how that kind of reveals itself also in the imagery of Songbirds.
Yeah, so I think while I was writing this book, I'd started writing it, and again, I think it was that Christmas before COVID, and I went to my auntie's for Christmas, and my cousin was there, and I was telling him about the story, and then for some weird reason, and I can't remember for the life of me how we got onto this subject, but he said to me, do you remember my dad back in the day, like when we were kids, that his dad used to poach songbirds, which isn't unusual because a lot of the men back then did. And they hunted these songbirds and they caught like a handful of them. What happened later as we grew up is it became a huge underground organization, which was a bit like drug dealing. Once you were in, you couldn't get out. And these men were not poaching 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 birds. They were killing them in thousands with glue sticks and mist nets and all sorts of things, and making a hell of a lot of money. So we were talking about that. And then I said to him, you know, I'm writing about people migrating and what it means. And I thought, isn't it beautiful? I said to him how these birds, you know, they're migrating from Africa to Europe in search, from Europe to Africa in the winter in search of a warmer climate. And then they go back and then they come back. And what they're always searching for, in a way, the way that I understood it in my head, is warmth, is safety, it's, you know, they fly together in search of what they think is going to be best for them at that particular time of year, or, you know. And I said to him, it reminds me of the women that I'm writing about. And we had this discussion about that whether we're a bird or a human or whatever, that what every creature wants is safety and warmth, and I guess freedom. So we had this discussion, and by having that discussion, I then decided that using the birds as a metaphor would really fit with what I was writing about. And then thinking about the birds and what happens to them. So people put up with these glue sticks onto the trees. The birds don't know they're there. So they come down, they land on what they think is a normal branch, but it's not. And it's really sad because the more they try and escape, the more stuck they get. And I found a similar thing with the women, with the stories they were telling me. The more they tried to escape, the more stuck they got. So something so fundamental like freedom, you know, how are we? I thought this is at the time I was like, this is 2020. How are there people that have been treated almost like slaves? You know, how is it that what these women want is security, warmth, freedom, and what they've been met with in a way is a cage? So it was these thoughts. And, you know, I guess it's different with the refugees that I was writing about, because they were escaping from something that was, you know, they had to, in a way, because they would die, basically. You know, like Nuri and Afra, he says to her, if we stay, we die. And at one point she doesn't care, and she says, so be it. But then she realizes, no, come on, let's go. You know, that she has a desire to live, and they have to go. With the migrant women that I spoke about, the domestic workers, it wasn't so dire, as in a bomb wasn't going to fall on their head, but they had normal desires to I don't know, to make sure their family were well looked after, to find a better way of life for either themselves or for their family. So it's a different thing, you know, it's different. But then what I suppose where it's similar is when refugees reached their place of safety, they then wanted to be there and feel accepted and feel free and you know, and that's, I think, where the idea of being a refugee or a migrant sort of come together, because often they find themselves in countries where they're not being accepted. They don't find the warmth that they want. There's no freedom because they're not given or granted any freedom, or, you know, so there's a lot in my head about all this. And I've had so many conversations with people, and I hope I haven't waffled too much.
So I just love to know, how do you go about sort of drawing the real life experiences that people are telling to you and the stories they give with these sort of overarching imagery and sort of icons that you have that appear throughout your work? I just love to know, is it that you talk to people and that kind of illuminates these metaphors that you want to use to represent their story, and then you build that through how you say it? Or is it the other way around, that you have an overarching concept that already exists? I just love to know a bit more about the process.
God, it's hard to say. I think what I do, I'm just trying to remember. I have an overriding concept in terms of the emotional, or what I believe to be the emotional truth, or the thing that the truth that I'm trying to portray. So in this case, it was the women, the women migrating and then becoming trapped and then having no voice. And so that was the overriding concept. And then from that concept, I then go and interview people and hear stories. And what I tend to do with the stories that I hear, like when I was interviewing these women, I didn't write anything down or record anything. I just let it I just allow it to kind of go into my mind, and I just sort of absorb what I can, and I don't try and remember specific things. What stays in my mind does, or what drops out of my mind does. I just listen like you would in any conversation, and I just let it become a part of my mind and a part of my, you know, my emotions, and then I try and use it in a way that's okay. By hearing all these stories, I've understood all these things. I'm not necessarily going to use one story or another, but what have I learned from it? Let me kind of sit with it, digest it, and then I start writing, and then I have the overall concept, and then from that the metaphors, I guess, sort of come and then connect with those things. So it's usually overall concept, then the stories, allowing them to digest, and then allowing the imagery and the metaphors to then connect with that stuff.
Yeah, I guess it all kind of feeds into each other as the kind of creative process sort of follows through. So I'd love to know, like, if you have any advice for people who are trying to write on really complex social issues where they're sort of representing different people and trying to really communicate something very important or very personal, either to them or to others. As I know that a lot of people really want to make a change through literature and writing on these challenging topics, but are always, I guess, filled with anxieties of not saying it in the right way, or of not conveying the narrative or having it interpreted in the way that they'd hoped.
Yeah, I can completely relate to those anxieties. First of all, it's completely normal to have those anxieties. And actually, I think having those anxieties can make a piece of writing better, because you will question you can't question too much to the point that it hinders your writing, you don't write anything. But I would say use that anxiety. You have something you want to say. You're anxious about it. Am I going to, this is something I'm so passionate about. Will I portray it well enough? Will I get people to understand what it is that I want to say? Use that anxiety. And I guess, I know that people might say, well, what does it mean to use that anxiety? And I'll just give you an example of how I use it. So I have something that I want to say, which is, why are these women treated like this? Why are they not heard? So instead of writing that down as a sentence, I create a scenario in the story. I create a scene that will depict a woman who's not being heard, or that will depict a woman who's sacrificed something, for example. So create scenes that will allow the reader to walk with the characters and feel what they're feeling. And at the end of that, then they will understand what you're trying to say. Don't tell them. It's the classic thing of show, don't tell. And I think if you show rather than tell, if you allow your reader to walk with you or walk with the characters, then it's more likely that they're going to feel something at the end of it. So use the anxiety, use it by creating a scene that bubbles with that anxiety somehow, that presents it. Use your senses, use your environment, create a scene where two people are talking, where someone's alone and something's happened to them, where, you create one scene to begin with. And by the end of that scene, your reader should feel something. And that thing that they feel is the thing that you are trying to present. So I know it's easier if I'm teaching a group, and then I can say, now let's do it together, and then I can sort of exemplify what I mean as we're doing it together. But I would say to everybody, if you have an idea, you have a passion, pause, don't be overwhelmed, write one scene. And in that scene, don't say what it is that you want your reader to portray. The goal should be, by the time I get to the end of this scene, or the end of the page, or the end of the chapter, my reader will feel something of what I want them to feel.
I know you're also a lecturer in creative writing, so you're someone who's very used to building the skills of others. I wonder if you can give any advice to a lot of the people in this room work with younger students who are very keen to develop their creative writing skills, but maybe find those first steps quite difficult. I don't know if you've got any of your kind of golden strategies with slightly younger writers, just to enable them to start developing their creativity and growing their confidence.
I think it's something similar, because I've done this before, where I've worked with young students and at primary school. I worked with my old primary school teacher and did talks for primary school students on Zoom, which is quite difficult, because with children you want to be face to face, but obviously with the times we're living, it's not possible. So I think what I did with the students then was talk to them through, I wanted them to write a scene pretending that they were a refugee in a camp. So what's important with a young creative writing student, so let's say they're about 9 or 10 or 11 years old, is to get them to put themselves in that scene. So it's really quite simple. I just get them to think about their senses. So first of all, they close their eyes and I say, you're in the camp. I want you to imagine what you're hearing, what smells there are. Are there songs? Are there prayers? Are there people talking? Are there things you hear from the outside, like maybe a plane going past, and you're sad because you can't get on that plane and you're stuck in this camp, and and then what smells and what feelings they have, and then they'll open their eyes and I'll get them to imagine what they see in front of them. So it's all about using their senses and placing themselves into that scene. And by doing that, then they can place their characters there. Because what young children tend to do when they're writing is to say, I went to the camp, then we did this, then we ate dinner, then we said this, then we went to sleep, then we woke up, then we blah, blah, blah. And then you'll find like 25 then, blah, then, and when there's lots of thens, it means that they're desperately trying to tell a story, but they're not actually creating an environment that the reader can connect with. So it's all about getting the children to place themselves wherever they are. And often I say, I don't want any story. Let's just place ourselves there first. It might be in a garden, it might be somewhere by the sea, it might be in a camp, it might be in the middle of a war, depending on what you want to help the students to imagine. Or it might be some place that they know because they've lived through themselves, and they have to go back in their memory, which is more difficult because, something could be traumatic or whatever. But that's what I would do with young children, and then we introduce another character, then we introduce a story. So I start with a sense of place. And by the way, if you wanted me to, we can talk about this later, but I'd be happy once the baby's a little bit older to volunteer and to give the students some creative writing lessons over Zoom. If that would be
so amazing. We'll definitely come back to you on that. Just want to say that I love other people to start asking questions. It's probably easiest if you drop it into the chat, or if you put your hand up if you're sort of confident that your network is good enough to ask a question live. So I'm looking into the chat right now for loads of questions to start appearing while I just ask one more. So I'm really interested personally in developing empathy through our education curriculums and systems and programs in different ways. But I often find it quite difficult to do it in a way that's sort of natural and organic and really deeply impactful for students, and in a way where they really do connect with the issues in a deep way that moves beyond their imagination to an understanding of different people's lived experiences. And I think you're someone who very naturally in your writing, you can see that you empathize very naturally with the people that you are sharing the stories of and working with in different ways. But I want to know, how can we better build those skills and that mindset in our classrooms as teachers?
What, to help? Do you mean to help the children to empathize, to understand, to be able to put themselves in other people's shoes?
I guess a sort of mixture of empathy and compassion, that ability to really understand what somebody might feel, think, or experience, and translate it. Maybe I'm thinking of more compassion, translate it to action, and have that sense as you do, that you've experienced something that is very challenging, that really matters, and that actually you hold it with you and you want to take and do something in your life with it. And I believe that's a kind of response we can in different ways generate through education. And I just love to know, as a teacher myself, any ideas you have for how we can allow students to have that journey.
I guess I don't know, that I might be saying something that you already know, but for me, reading stories, because we connect so deeply. So it might be real life stories. So let's say it's about refugees, for example. So reading real life stories from other refugee children, or doesn't have to be children, could be refugee adults, but I suppose making it more relatable, maybe finding stories from children of their own age. So that's one thing. The other thing is the thing that I've mentioned before. So once they've done the reading, maybe done a bit of research, heard stories, maybe, all sorts of ways of hearing stories. It doesn't have to be reading stories. There might be a documentary. And I think the idea of stories is really important because we all have an opportunity to walk in somebody's shoes with a story, whether it's told through a documentary or written word, or whether it's a memoir, a piece of fiction. There's something about storytelling, I think. So that's one way. The other way is for them to tell the stories themselves. So like I said before, to put themselves. So the talk that I was doing with the primary schools was called Empathy and Creative Writing, coincidentally. So how I taught them to empathize, or how I taught them to try and empathize with the children who were refugees, was to get them to sort of close their eyes and imagine they were there, and imagine what they might have been through and what it would have felt like to have been in this airport, which had turned into a camp, and whether they would have missed their home. So when we did the feelings bit, it wasn't just tactile, they could think whether they were hot or cold or whatever, but I got them to think a lot about, well, what do you feel? You've left your home, you've left your toys, you've left your bed, you've left your friends. What does that feel like to you? What do you miss the most? So coming, writing about it, imagining that they were a refugee themselves, and being able to put it down on paper, I felt, because we read some refugee stories first before we did that activity. So it was that combination of reading and writing. So I guess because I'm a creative writing teacher, that's the methods. Those are the methods that I would use. But if someone was a geography teacher or a history teacher, I suppose they could use different methods. They could track the journey of refugees on a map, for example, or they could look at refugees historically, and so I suppose there's so many different ways around it. But I think listening to real life stories rather than just facts, or listening to fiction that depicts real life rather than just statistics, is something that I find that children really respond to.
Definitely. And I think the sort of whole creation of space for imagination and imaginative processing is something that can get lost sometimes in our classrooms today, particularly as students get a bit older. We lose that sense of imagination and play, which can allow these emotions to develop. I'm starting to get some questions in. So Gloria, who's one of our Ghanaian volunteers from the Aberfour spot, she's asking, and this is something I've actually reflected on myself, how do you write without people who are close to you feeling tagged, as our experiences with people may influence our writing? So I guess it's the question that maybe you really have strong things to communicate, but they're all based on characters that you have close links to, which maybe you wouldn't want to feel represented in your book without permission, or there might be sort of negative elements of things that might upset people. How can you still use those powerful experiences and relationships we all have whilst being sensitive to others in our world around us?
That's a really good question. I think just approaching it from a good place. I know that sounds a bit like, but if your intentions are good, people normally feel it. The thing is, I'm not usually going to take a person I know and portray them in my literature. As I said, I usually sort of absorb the stories and absorb the experiences and then create new people, different scenes. However, there are times when a real life, someone in real life inspires me so much. Like, for example, with Beekeeper, Dr. Riad Al-Sus inspired the Mustafa, for example. Once I met Dr. Al-Sus, the character of Mustafa shifted and changed, and I was so inspired by him, and I guess I just allowed it to happen, and I just trusted that I was doing a good thing and an okay thing. There was Angeliki in Beekeeper. There was a woman who used to come into the centre, and she had started to go mad because of all the experiences she had. So she was telling me that she'd been poisoned and that they'd stolen her baby, and I believed that they'd stolen her baby. And from that, she'd sort of started to lose her mind, and she was getting talcum powder and putting it on her face. And I think it's because she wanted to disappear. And so I used those images in my story, and I trusted that I had good intentions, that I wanted, that she had affected me so much that I couldn't think of a better way to portray what she had been through. And then with Songbirds, Nisha was so inspired by my friend Manaka, so much. So whenever I was writing about Nisha, I would remember how beautiful Manaka is and how inspired and in awe of her I was. So I used that, but I created a new woman, a different woman, She looked different, she acted different, she spoke differently. She had one daughter and not two. But in my heart, I knew I was thinking about Menaka. So is that a bad thing? I don't know. I guess where it gets complicated is if we're writing about people that we don't approve of or we don't like. And where I can answer that part of the question is not necessarily with a person, but a place. So when I wrote about Cyprus and what was going on with the domestic workers, I felt that the book was highlighting a side of Cyprus that wasn't so pretty, because we normally think of Cyprus, oh, it's beautiful, we'll go there on holiday, blah, blah, blah. But this was a side that's not so pretty. You have the poaching, you have the domestic workers that were ignored so much that it led to something completely horrific. So my auntie said to me, but how can you write about Cyprus like this? And I said to her, she said, oh, but look at what you're doing. I said, I'm not doing anything. I'm just writing what I see. So I guess then in that situation, you just have to have the courage and say, well, okay, this person is beautiful or this place is beautiful, but there's also this side. And am I going to silence myself, or do I really want to write about this? So I guess it's a mixed bag. It depends. But I would say just trust yourself. If you have something to say, even if it does portray a person or a place badly, try and disguise it if you can. But if you really have to use something, do it, because if your intentions are good, I think that will shine through.
That's a great answer. And I guess that with every challenge or difficulty you might present in a character or a place, there's always another side to it, and that having more complex understanding of things always makes your writing richer in different ways. Yeah. Gloria is saying thank you. I hope you got your answer. You've got your question answered, Gloria. So Laura is wondering whether you've always written, and I've wondered this too. I'd love to know whether, at what point did you start writing as a sort of fairly full-time professional, though I also know you're a lecturer, and is it something you always had a passion for, or is it something that maybe grew as you had these very strong experiences that then led into your work?
I definitely always wanted to write. So since I was about 9 years old, like completely just knew that I wanted to be a writer. And the weird thing is, this teacher that I told you about that I've been in contact with, so he was my year 6 teacher, Mr. Barraclough. And when I was in year 5, Miss Hill, I used to, because I went out for dinner with her just before COVID, and she said to me that, because what she did is she put me into the special class for English because she thought I wasn't good at it. So she told my parents, and my parents panicked and found me a tutor. And after the first lesson, the tutor said to them, I don't know why the teacher put her into the special class, because I think that she has a gift with writing, and I predict, he said, that she's going to write books and do a PhD. So somehow he saw that in me from when I was 9 years old. And so it turned out that it was not that I wasn't good at English. I just wasn't, it didn't look like I was listening because I was daydreaming. But I was absorbing things, but I was sort of daydreaming and not responding. So she thought that I was just like, couldn't do anything. Anyway, so I loved this teacher. So every week we'd read a comprehension, which was a story. And then based on what I'd learned from that particular story, he'd then get me to do a piece of creative writing. And this was week after week after week after week until I did my A-levels. And I took it so seriously. So I'd create these stories and I'd kind of draw borders and round them and pictures and all sorts of things. And because we were reading comprehensions, we were all often reading about social issues or things like women in society or relationships and how they were portrayed, or people that had suffered something. Or so that, I guess that's when I started to become really aware of like society and people, and and those were the kind of things I ended up writing about even when I was younger. Like environmental issues. I remember I wrote a poem called True Tree Friends that ended up getting published in this little green poetry book for children, which was like a huge thing they did with all the schools, and there was a competition and a few children were being picked from each school. So it was since then. And then I guess I went and studied literature. I did a BA in literature, and then I did an MA in creative writing. And then from my MA, I realized that I wanted to write more about Cyprus and about the war. So then I did a PhD, which allowed in creative writing, which allowed me to write that first book, which I never ever talk about, but A Watermelon, a Fish and a Bible, because I feel like I wrote that when I was a different, like in a different stage of my life. So that's why I forget to talk about it. So that was the first novel I wrote. And then I went through a period where I wasn't writing. And then I came back to writing again and teaching a few years later.
Interesting. So yeah, I actually have, I'm just going to encourage other people to keep posting questions on the chat. And actually I've just seen I've got 2 more coming through. So Nana, who's our head of educational partnerships in the staff team of EduSpots in Ghana, says being a writer with 1 million copies sold is not small. Perhaps any tips on how to go about making sure your story is read, and sales tips, because I guess there are many wonderful books out there that just haven't had the exposure and the readership that yours has. How did it grow to being read by so many people?
Well, the thing is, I'm not really involved in the marketing. That's what my publishers will do. So if anyone here is interested in getting published, unless you're self-published, that's a different story. And I don't know much about self-publishing. I don't think I'd be very good at it, because I'm not very good at things like marketing. And I can't even sell myself very well, because if I go to interviews, I'm never chosen. I just don't sell myself well. So well, there's so many interviews I went for where I was like, I know I could do this job. And then someone will ask me about myself and I'm like, it's different now because I'm being interviewed. I don't feel like it's an interview that leads to a job, for example. So I'm free and I'm talking. Whereas if I felt that I'm trying to sell myself in any way, I just sort of freeze and get scared and go blank. So I can relate to the difficulties people have with things like that. If you self-publish, you'd have to learn to self-publicize. If you have publishers, then your publishers will do it for you. But what I am going to say, and where I contributed, and I contributed a lot, is going to do these talks. So now we're doing it over Zoom, but I did so many in real life. And I think that helped with selling the books. But what it also helped with, which was really important to me, is to open discussion about these things. So imagine being in a hall and there's about 50, 60, 70 people in there, and you're talking about refugee experiences, and there might be refugees in the audience as well, and then sort of finding a way to open those discussions. So it might be, let's say you've written something that you love, and let's say you're self-published, so that you don't have your publishers organizing your marketing and publicity. Let's say you are self-published. My advice would be, find a way to open discussions about what you've written. It might be on Twitter, on Facebook. So rather than saying, here's the book I've written, and if there's like a theme, if there's like a thing that you're passionate about, say, raise a question about that thing. Get people engaged so I think that's why I kept being invited to talk more and more, because I was so passionate about the thing I was talking about. Like, I wanted to speak to the audience. And like, if I was there now, I might even ask questions, or I'd want to hear people's experiences. And then when I was signing books, I'd ask, like, it would take me ages to leave, because I'd hear all these stories about people's own refugee experiences, whether it was that their neighbor was a refugee, or their grandmother was, or something. So if my advice would be, talk, open questions, listen to people. If you can do it face to face, do it. Like, you might organize a group where you're discussing something, or use social media and raise these important questions and be passionate about them. Talk to people, hear them, answer questions, ask questions. That would be my advice.
That's really great advice. I'm just putting 2 of us on the screen now, as I've had a bit of an issue with the spotlighting, so that it's always on you and not everyone can see us both. So yeah, just Nana's following that up with, are you available for some coaching sessions with EduSpots volunteers who love to write about Ghana, Africa stories and culture? And just want to before you answer, just let you know that we're also this year doing a big focus on bringing Africa to the bookshelf and making sure that in all these spots, which are mostly across Ghana and Kenya, that there are more books from local authors, because we found actually even within Ghana itself, it's very difficult to buy really good quality books from local authors, even though they exist, that they're just not in circulation as much. And this leads to this really significant issue of kids reading books that have ice screams in and just represent scenes that don't represent their community or culture at all. And I think a bit like you're saying, we're trying to create a conversation around this rather than just this talk tonight actually is in support of buying more African books for all the centres across EduSpots. Rather than just by going with a sort of give us money for this cause, what we like to do, as we are today in part, is creating a conversation around social issues and representation.
I'd be very open to discussing, doing workshops or things like that. So, we can communicate after and see what we can organise.
I think you better, warn you that we will be very grateful for your support, and you might quickly be drawn into EduSpots, which is a very passionate group of literacy and STEM volunteers. We actually have our own.
Honestly, it sounds wonderful. I'd love to be involved.
We actually have our own storybooks, just so that we've dipped our toe into publishing as an NGO, that we have written stories that basically capture community experiences and community events that are actually based in our spots. And the books are all kind of co-written between different people in different communities, with a Ghanaian illustrator illustrating them based on stories of our spots. And they're based on a bird flying from community to community. I'll send you them. I'll send you them after the session. But maybe one day when we continue to perfect our art as writers, you might see them on bookshelves across the world.
That sounds wonderful. I'd love to be involved. Obviously, I have a 4-month-year-old baby, so it's I'll have to try and find a way to kind of work around that, or we can wait a few months until after the summer when things sort of settle down a bit. But I would love to be involved. So we can talk more about that.
That's really great news. And I'd love to, we maybe got one more time for one more question, but I will just take the opportunity to ask a question myself that I've often thought about writing a book about EduSpots' story. As it's this, we've got this story shared between about 300 volunteers of these 50 education centres being set up across the country. And the special thing about EduSpots is that everyone knows each other. It's become this very close network. We meet in person on occasion. And if you're short of time, you wouldn't want to be on our WhatsApp feeds, as there's just constant activity of all the education initiatives going on. And I would love someday for there to be a book, and I love writing myself, but haven't quite developed your level of ability at depicting things. But when you have a story that is shared between many people, I'd just love some advice on how you go about, ultimately one person or several have to be the ones telling the story, but how can you make it clear that this story has multiple people's perspectives shown in it, so that it's not mine, particularly as a Western person, dominating a story that has emerged through many Ghanaian community members?
So there's so many different ways of doing that. You've really got me thinking now, because it would be like a beautiful sort of kaleidoscope of stories, but you might want to have something at its center, something that sort of keeps coming back to a central point. Like what is there a place or something that connects all these stories, or a person or an event that everyone's going to go to, or something that's sort of, so that there'll be this central thing, and from there comes out the stories, almost like branches. So what might be, because I don't know what the stories are, so I can't give an example, but what might be the thing that's sort of something that's sort of in the present, that there's this is one example I can give you. There's a story going on in the present where somehow all the people's whose stories you're hearing are in a particular room or a particular place for some particular reason. So you as the narrator will sort of write in third person. And from that, you sort of go into the different people's minds and tell the different stories. That's one way of doing it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of just basically having something that clearly bridges everything together. I'll definitely think further about that. Got a question from Eric, who's also another member of our team, asking whether following your interaction with people maybe after your books. And I'd actually love to just hear a bit about what the feedback has been, what response you've had to Songbirds in particular, as we focused on that today. Has there ever been anything you've wanted to change or go back and rewrite? As this is something I've often thought about, that you write a book and it's very much printed and out there. You don't usually get a chance to do revisions. Is there anything that you would have written differently?
Well, with Songbirds, I'm still not sure about the first page. So there was
you do very thoroughly now.
And actually my partner doesn't like the first page. He says I should have started the story from chapter 2. So I've always kind of thought, should I have left out that first page? Maybe I needed to leave it out. And so I've never really made my peace with that. So that's maybe if I could go back, I would change that. But I try not to think too much about the story and obsess about it, because otherwise it's just like going down a rabbit hole, and then you're like, oh my God, I should have changed that and that and that. And it can drive you insane.
Do you spend a lot of time, out of interest, the sort of editing period where you've written the whole thing and then there must be a phase where everything is being kind of reviewed and finalized for publishing? How long does that take until you're ready for it to go out?
So I probably about 8 months or so. It does take a while. It really takes a while. I bet, but with Songbirds, actually, it was shorter because. So I think I finished writing it in about November, December. And then, so we had to do the entire edit by May. So that wasn't long. And it's a lot of backwards and forwards. And I think also there was a first part to his question. I don't remember what it was.
I think just, is there a portion of the book you would like to review or reshape? I think was his question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I did answer it. Yeah, I was worried that I didn't answer it. But yeah, mostly that first bit. But there's always, I mean, if I sat down and thought about Beekeeper and thought about Songbirds, I'd come up with it. So, I should have done this or this or this or this. But seriously, that can drive you insane. So I try not to do that. But I try and learn from things. So I take reviews very seriously. Some people don't read their reviews. I read my positive and negative reviews. And, you know, with Songbirds, I've had absolutely beautiful reviews. And I've had a lot of people saying to me that they prefer it to Beekeeper. And other people say they prefer Beekeeper to Songbirds. And then when I say to them, oh, can you tell me why you prefer this one to this one? I really listen to the answer, because actually I feel, well, I might learn something from my next book.
Yeah, I definitely think with feedback, it's important to say, even whether if you disagree with it, that just having someone's perspective on your work is such a beautiful thing that you can learn from in different ways.
Yeah, but then you get something like, I'll give you an example. So one of my friends said, I preferred Beekeeper. And I said, why? And he said, because Songbirds was quieter and Beekeeper was more intense. And then another friend of mine said, I preferred Songbirds. And I said, why? And they were like, because Songbirds was quieter. So, do you see what I mean? And it's like, okay, I don't really know what to do with that, but you know, but then if you're reading your reviews and you sort of see that there's a pattern of people saying a certain thing, then I tend to go, oh, so many people have said this, maybe it's something I could take on board. So I think
it's kind of noticing patterns, and then that's something that then you look to respond to. That's really interesting. But maybe that one-off comment that really didn't like page one of your book
exactly
something you need to necessarily take into account. So just before we close with the final question I'm going to ask you, I just want to remind everyone that if they'd like to make a donation to our Year of African Books, where we're looking to fill all 50 spots with at least one bookcase of really good quality books, whether fiction, non-fiction, or children's African books by local authors. We're on a bit of a drive, as well as trying to create awareness of this issue. So do drop a donation into the Just Giving page, which has just been circulated. So Christy, just if there was one message you wanted to leave us with, whether it's about literature, writing, or anything more widely, what would you leave us with today?
Oh, I don't know. Let me
always put people on the spot.
Okay. Something that connects with everything that we've been saying. I suppose I'm sorry if this sounds a bit corny, but if you have something in your heart that you want to say, just find a way to say it. I think that kind of links with everything we've been talking about.
I think it definitely does, and I think you use your book so brilliantly as a medium to express things that are so important to you so clearly, and we really feel your passion today and in the writing, and also the people's stories and lives that you are asking us all to engage with. So thank you once again for joining our EduSpots Author Talks. You're our second author of what we hope will one day be a globally viewed YouTube series. So thank you once again from me and from everybody who's joined tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and we'll be in contact as well.